Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome. Is there an echo, Callie?
Yes, there is.
Okay. Is that better? Great. Okay.
Can I have you mute your audio also?
All right. Here we go. Welcome to the first session of Housing Our Future's focus in specific areas that we have outlined in the plan. We're really happy to have you with us this morning. We have some really great panelists and wonderful moderator to help us go through the day, but I just wanted to welcome you. My name is Kristen Baker. I'm the Executive Director of the LIST office here in Greater Cincinnati, and today we're going to be talking about the challenges that COVID has created or exacerbated with respect to housing instability and evictions in our community. We ask that you please keep yourself muted at all times. There's a large number of participants here today, so we want to try and minimize background noise. And please feel free to send questions to the host. Questions you have for our speakers, please send them via the chat box that you see on your bottom right of the screen, and we will be sure to try to get through as many of those as we can. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to our very first presenter, who is well known to many of us here in Cincinnati and is now spending her time in Columbus working for the Ohio Capital Corporation. This is Peg Myrtle. She's President and CEO of Ohio Capital. Welcome, Peg. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks to all of you for joining. A critical topic in our and I apologize for the background. It's not one of those fake backgrounds. I'm actually sitting in a car and using a hotspot to connect because we're trying to get a little vacation in today. But I do want to outline some of what I understand are the existing conditions and some of the things that are happening around the state of Ohio from a state perspective, as well as a special program that Ohio Cap has put in place to assist renters who are facing an issue with their ability to pay. So just to sort of frame it up, since March, 50% of Ohioans over the age of 18 have experienced the loss of income or had a household member who did. 35% expect a loss of income in the next 4 weeks. That was based on I think, July data. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience with the 100 property management companies we work with and what's going on in our portfolio. About 20% of adult renters in Ohio did not pay rent in July, and that's consistent with our portfolio. Obviously, this is has disparate impact in communities of color and low-income communities, and we have been concerned. So since March and April, when folks were sent home from work, and if you think about the kinds of jobs that a lot of low-income tenants have, they are often service jobs or retail or hospitality, and those are some of the areas most dramatically impacted by job loss. And so fortunately, the $1,200 payment helped a lot of people make rent that first month or two, and then $600 extended unemployment also helped a lot. The greater challenge has been that there are pockets where the challenge has been greatest. So, we work primarily with low-income housing tax credit projects, and the folks who are in senior housing or the folks who are in Section 8 housing have not been as dramatically impacted because they can get recertified as their income goes down and the federal government pays a greater share of their rent. The biggest hit has been on two specific segments in our experience. One is the unsubsidized family housing, those folks who are just the working poor who live in tax credit housing or in naturally occurring affordable housing, they're the ones who've been most dramatically hit because there's no adjustment on their rent. The second is are people in market rate units. So when we look at our portfolio, where we've seen some stress have been on some of the mixed income properties. And it's not the affordable units that have been stressed in the it's been in the residents in the market rate, because a lot of times those folks just above, you know, there's still rent burdens in many cases relative to their income. We are certainly that with that payment ending at the end of July, we saw some degradation, as this shows, in July of 20%, 20 to 25% of renters were not able to pay rent in July, and we are expecting, we see a little more degradation in August. We don't have the final real numbers, but anecdotally we know that there's been a little more flood of people who have been unable to pay their rent. We are expecting that in September we'll see a much more dramatic change. So what's happening? What are the initiatives that are being undertaken? Certainly, there is a great hope that the unemployment, expanded unemployment, would be continued. The executive order by the president was another factor, and Ohio has applied for those funds at the lower level, so not the one where the state matches. So it would be like a $300 payment. That's not in place yet. There's no money flowing. Similarly, the House bill has included another round of payments, both I think individual payments and also the expanded employment. Again, there's no action on that, and frankly, no indication that there's going to be anything on that. And the House and the Senate have not been able to come to terms on anything, so it doesn't look like there is going to be federal relief coming. Meanwhile, back in April, Governor Wine signed an executive order to provide rent assistance for small businesses, but did not act on housing, and has not acted on housing at the state level in terms of rent assistance since. And the other thing, of course, is that the moratorium on evictions ended on July 25th, and again, Trump's executive order does not extend that moratorium.
Peg, I think we lost you. Maybe you can turn off your video. I think the audio is degrading a little bit.
Relevant agencies to try to work on something, but there's nothing. There's no clear. Resolution yet. What what we are seeing to start with, and we're using that to cover 85% of unpaid rent of family property. So be eligible, the project has to be a housing tax credit project that's received an investment from us and is still in its initial compliance period. The project has to be unsubsidized and in good standing from an asset management perspective. And
All right, so sorry, I seem to be having some technical difficulties here. So we're going to move ahead to, oh, Peg, there you are. We're going to move ahead to John Schreider, who is the Director of Legal Aid Society, Southwest Ohio. So John, are you there?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks to Peg for that overview about how things are standing in the state of Ohio and the efforts that her great organization is making to try to address some of those problems. A lot of great information on the PowerPoint slides there, and it was great to hear from her, even though we had a bad connection in some cases. So, Housing Our Future is a great effort. Hundreds of people have worked on this effort, literally. And one thing I want to note is that the Housing Our Future planning began way before the pandemic. Seems like another century. And even before the pandemic, Housing Our Future recognized that housing stability is a major problem in Cincinnati and Hamilton County, and that includes evictions. Evictions are bad. They're bad for the families that get evicted. They're bad for landlords, of course, and they're bad for the whole community. And, you know, fortunately, Housing Our Future has identified policies and programs that can be implemented to deal with the growing eviction crisis that we have. So just real quickly, I'll give a little bit of a background overview of where we were in Cincinnati and Hamilton County pre-pandemic. We had a lot of evictions. There was a study done by sociologists from UC, studying a period of time, 2014 to 2017, and what she found is that the eviction rate in Hamilton County is way above the national average. Not the kind of thing you want to be a leader in, right? But unfortunately, we are. A couple other things that are really relevant that the study found. Landlords win eviction cases, tenants do not. Landlords have lawyers, very few tenants have lawyers. And those are all very important things. If we could move ahead to the next slide, please. Most evictions in Hamilton County are filed because the tenant is behind in their rent, and that's very important. Also, equally important is evictions disproportionately affect African American families, and that is certainly an added concern. So there are things that can be done, but before we get to those things, well, I should say that as a result of that study and other advocacy, there were some serious efforts and some progress in implementing some programs, including emergency rental assistance, on a small level in Cincinnati and in Hamilton County. I think since that time, and now that we're faced with the growing eviction crisis as a result of the pandemic, evictions are a huge crisis. So there never was a statewide eviction moratorium in Ohio. There was a moratorium on certain kinds of so-called federal housing, but it wasn't an across-the-board moratorium. And currently, as Peg Myrtle pointed out, there is no national moratorium. There is no additional federal money coming out of Washington as a result of any executive orders. So what's happening is the pause on evictions that was occurring here in Hamilton County for a period of about 3 months has stopped. Landlords are filing eviction cases, and they are getting hearings in their eviction cases. The number of eviction cases is approaching the number that we had before March, and that's a bad thing. And that is happening even before the federal moratorium, the end of the federal moratorium is kicking in, and that will result in even more evictions. So it's a total crisis. So the good news is that our community has stepped up and done some things. Money came to Hamilton County government as a result of the CARES Act, and the Hamilton County Commissioners allocated several $1 million in additional emergency rental assistance to help families that are being evicted as a result of non-payment related to the pandemic and the related economic issues. So what I've got on the next slide here is just a quick overview of the 3 main agencies that are dispersing the money from the CARES Act funds that Hamilton County allocated for emergency rental assistance. And you see it's the Community Action Agency, Talbert House, and the Free Store. In addition, I want to note that the St. Vincent de Paul continues to operate a smaller program, primarily in the city of Cincinnati. Also worth noting is that the Hamilton County Department of Job and Family Services has been using its PRC program as a way to assist people with emergency rental assistance if they are low-income families with children. So there are quite a few resources out there. The resources, these agencies are actually being inundated with requests for assistance. But they're dealing with it, and I think the main message that we're trying to deliver to our client community and the community as a whole is that people who are in trouble and behind on their rent need to reach out and not wait for going to court. They need to reach out now for help and get in line to get assistance if at all possible. So I think what this crisis shows us is that evictions are a huge problem. They're not going to go away. This problem is not going to go away, and we really need to have long-term solutions for this problem. I think a permanent rental assistance program to avoid evictions is something that we really need. That's part of the Housing Our Future recommendations. We also need to look at additional protections for tenants. A number of places, not just the East and West Coast, states like Virginia and Maryland have adopted legislation statewide that requires landlords to accept rent from tenants to avoid eviction. Some people might think that if tenants get the money under the CARES Act program here, the landlord has to take the money. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And even though most landlords are accepting that money, some are not. And that's going to continue to be the case. And we need improved policies to make sure that we have an equitable and fair eviction process in Ohio and in Hamilton County. And it's only fair that if tenants can make a landlord whole in a non-payment of rent case, that the landlord should be required to take the rent. There are a number of other housing policies that relate to housing stability that are in the plan. A lot of great ideas, and I think that our challenge as a community here is to work for implementation of that and the other great recommendations in the plan. So that's my presentation. Thanks very much. I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists and comments.
Thank you, John. Just confirming that everybody can hear me and that the audio and visual is working.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, John. My name is Tom Carroll, Village Manager in Silverton. I want to talk about two studies. If you can go ahead a slide, please. Two studies that I've had the pleasure of being involved in, and one more slide, please. I'm going to talk about two studies related to evictions in our first suburbs. By way of background, I became interested in this particular topic because I've had the honor of being a research fellow through ICMA, which is my professional association out of DC, and that I was a research fellow in 2018 and 2019 in addition to being the village manager in Silverton, and I got to do a deep dive as part of that fellowship looking at the state of the 33 first suburbs in our region that are depicted on this map. If you go forward one slide, you'll see the results from my research were really alarming to me. These 33 first suburbs, 2/3 of them are experiencing decline, and I looked at data basically going back to the 2008 recession. The rate of decline is pretty severe in some of our first suburbs, and it's truly disturbing, and in many ways, the local governments, including my own, are not responding with the degree of urgency that I think is needed. Looking at this table to the left of this slide, you'll see that I break it down on three fundamental variables, one of which is poverty. And poverty is the key indicator, in my opinion, that indicates whether or not a first suburb is declining. And there are now more people below the poverty line in suburbs in the United States than there are in central cities or in rural America. Poverty has very much spread to the suburbs, and yet most of our suburbs are not acting with the same degree of urgency that this warrants. And because I think poverty is a key indicator of whether a community is declining, that naturally leads into an interest in eviction. Matthew Desmond, in his book, has very clearly and articulately shown that evictions are not as much a result of poverty, but in fact are a cause of it. And so it follows if a first suburb like Silverton needs to be concerned about poverty, then by necessity we need to be concerned about evictions. And if you go forward a slide, John had mentioned this great work by Alana Wolfe-Johns, who was at the University of Cincinnati and has now joined the faculty at the University of Missouri St. Louis. I met Alana a couple years ago when her study came out that looked at 2014 to 2017 evictions, and we worked together to combine my research on first suburbs and her research on evictions. You go forward one more slide. It's the same table that I just presented, but I blew it up so that you have a better chance of reading it. And I just want to point out, again, this is 2014 to 2017 data for eviction filings. These show the 15 out of the 33 first suburbs that have an eviction filing rate during that 4-year period above the national average. 15 of the 33 first suburbs are above the national average. To give you some additional context, these 15 communities have a population collectively of over 100,000 people. So this is very much, Elena has shown, very much not just a city of Cincinnati issue. This is a county issue, including these other communities, including my own. And you'll see that looking at some of these numbers further down, 8 of the first suburbs have double-digit eviction filing rates. 8 of the 33 suburbs have an eviction filing rate. That means 1 out of every 10 rental units each year is being the subject of an eviction filing. So this is a grave problem in outside of the city of Cincinnati, and candidly, we in the first suburbs governments are not doing an adequate job of researching the problem, understanding it, and doing anything about it. Next slide, please. So this summer, following up on the work that Alana and I did together, which we'll share a paper if you're interested, that was in a City Manager magazine in July. I decided to do a deeper dive into the Silverton eviction cases over that same 4-year period. I engaged a very inexpensive research assistant, my daughter, to look at all 325 eviction cases that were filed in that 4-year period within the village of Silverton. This is one of the tables from our report, and what I want to highlight here is that if in this blue box you'll see almost 50% of the Silverton eviction cases during this period were for under $1,000 of rent. And again, as Peg and John have talked about, for the tenant, that is an insurmountable amount of money, but from a public policy standpoint, I think this helps me, at least as one administrator, get my arms around what is the magnitude of the problem that we're talking about on an ongoing basis in a community like Silverton. Again, 132 of these evictions were filed for under $1,000. Something that we can start to address. 70% are for under $1,500. So again, in public policy world, this is a lot of money, but not really a lot of money. Next slide, please. This shows very similar data, but I tried to calculate the amount of time, how many months behind in rent were these people who faced eviction. And you'll see here that over 50% had been less than 2 months behind in their rent, and that's depicted in the first blue box. So people face eviction even before they fall 1 month behind in rent, or 2 months certainly. I also want to highlight, and I think this bears mentioning, that on the far right you see that some landlords are actually, in my opinion, relatively late filing an eviction case. You can see that they have extended more than 6 months of back rent to these tenants, and I think it's important as we engage in this discussion and work with landlords, which we need to include in our public policy discussions, that we don't paint them all with the same brush. There are as many landlords who are, I think, too quick to file for an eviction as there are who extend what I would think is more credit than most reasonable people would. Go to the next slide. So my research on first suburbs and then the deeper dive into evictions, both within those first suburbs and within the village of Silverton, has led me to realize that we need to do something about this at the local government level. In the research on first suburbs, all of the policy solutions that are offered talk about changes in federal and state law. Without getting into politics right now, I think we can all agree that the federal government is not operating at its best at the moment. And I think at the state level, we are now on our 4th Speaker of the House in the last 2 years. There was recently, just this week, 3 representatives who have filed impeachment articles against our governor for how he has handled our pandemic. My point is simply that this isn't even on the periphery of the public policy agenda in Columbus, and unfortunately at the federal level. So whatever needs to be done at the local level. And I want to try and urge colleagues in local government to do something about evictions, because it's in our, even if it's not in your heart, it is in our best interest to do so. So the paper that Deirdre and I wrote talks about 3 policy objectives. One is creating local government paid for eviction stabilization and prevention grants. So I am looking at, should we create a metric that says each local government should set aside $2 to $5 per person to create an eviction prevention stabilization grant. We'll need private partners like legal aid to help us figure that out. We also echo John's comments about pay-to-stay legislation. I learned about this from Virginia Talent with the City of Cincinnati Solicitor's Office, and I've become a believer that we need to pass legislation to do that. And then we need rental registration programs that get a better handle on fair housing and what landlords are doing in our region. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for providing that overview, and to the other panelists have as well. So my name is Janae Bradley, and I am a Senior Manager at the United Way of Greater Cincinnati, and really happy to be your moderator for the question and answer period. So I want to emphasize that if you do have questions, please send them through the chat to the panel, and we'll try to get as many of those questions answered as possible. Before I get to that point, I want to share a little bit about what we've been seeing at United Way. So as a United Way, we fight for the health, education, and financial stability for everyone in our 10-county regions, covering 3 states, and Hamilton County happens to be one of those counties. When we talk about housing and these challenges of evictions, we know that all of these other areas, so education, health, nutrition, childcare, all interconnected into housing. Prior to COVID-19, we were seeing that 1 in 5 families in our greater Cincinnati region brought in less than 200% of the federal poverty level in income, meaning that there are some weak financial ties and unstable financial ground for those families. And as we think about that number, even prior to this pandemic, we know that that was already bad enough. But as more folks are losing their jobs, which impacts housing, we plan to see that number greatly shift and not for the better. So we know that, as mentioned, that housing is a financial or foundational piece of all of the work that we do. And we're happy to partner in with organizations that are addressing not only housing, but the holistic needs of families. So being a part of the Place Matters initiative that looks at communities at an individual level and says, how do we provide for the needs of folks in our neighborhoods and the places where they live and work. We were one of the funders in the Regional Response Fund, the COVID-19 Regional Response Fund, and one of the biggest areas that we saw for financial need was in the space of housing. And while we were able to provide support to organizations to afford for housing, the need wasn't fully covered. So in other pieces, we've been working with organizations like Family Independence Initiative to get dollars out of the door to help families cover the rental costs that they currently have. And this only builds on all of the great things that our prior panelists have mentioned. And so I am happy now to transition to the Q&A portion of our discussion. So I would love for our lovely panelists to be prepared to answer a couple of questions. And I'll start with Tom, since we last heard from him. So Tom, it sounds like you're doing a lot of work in Silverton, and I'm wondering, are you seeing other first-ring suburbs or first suburbs doing this level of work alongside of you? And if not, what barriers do you think exist?
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer than I don't see a whole lot of focus or attention on evictions and poverty in first suburbs. I think the barrier is first and foremost a lack of awareness. Most cities, most villages, most townships, we are focused on paving roads and providing police and fire, and those are important basic services. We're not social service agencies. We're not really responsible for a lot of human service and social service provision. So we tend to try and stay in our lane. And the other thing I'll say is I commend the city of Cincinnati for their leadership in this area. This has been on the Cincinnati's radar for several years now. The downside of Cincinnati being a leader is that so often many jurisdictions in the first suburbs, and we look at what Cincinnati is doing and saying, thank God we don't have to deal with the challenges that they're dealing with, or there they go again, you know, they're dealing with some other issue that's not relevant to us. I don't think we understand adequately how relevant and important poverty and evictions are in our first suburbs. It's fundamentally an issue of resource. We need additional resource to help our residents. Fundamentally, I think if we don't do something to address poverty and specifically evictions, we're just going to get more challenged as communities, and there's no help, there's no cavalry coming to rescue us. So it's incumbent upon us in these local governments and first suburbs to do something to bend the curve. And I think it's important to point out that this is just part of dismantling structural racism that exists in our county and region and country. But I don't think we've crossed the mental Rubicon yet to get to that point among public officials at the local level, unfortunately.
Building on that a little bit, Tom, are you seeing any joining together? Have you reached out to any of your counterparts to see if they're experiencing the same or similar issues?
So yes, I mean, we as a group of professional city administrators and managers meet from time to time. Of course, during COVID, we're not doing that. The work that I was able to do with Alana Wolf-Johns was probably one of the first forays into this topic of evictions being important to city administrators. And I've had some pretty good feedback from colleagues saying this is good and important work, and I'm glad you're trying to raise attention to it. But I think all of us in first suburbs are facing challenges in our governance from COVID-19 itself and the fiscal crisis. And so we don't go out of our way to take on additional problems. We usually have enough on our own without wanting to grab more, unfortunately. But I think we need to do a better job. As we experience the next few months, this crisis will worsen, as Peg and John have articulated. And I think this is a moment where we can raise awareness among suburbs and figure out how to address this issue long term, like John talked about.
Thank you, John. So this is a question from our audience I think is a really great one, and anyone can respond to it. What can a family about to be displaced do if they have no credit, have lost their jobs, and have exhausted their savings?
And this is John, and I'll try to say something about that. So fortunately right now, I think we have a significant amount of financial resources available to in the form of the CARES Act funds administered by CAA, Halbert House, Freestore, as well as St. Vincent de Paul and the Job and Family Services. So, there is a significant amount of help available. Depending on what program you're talking about, you could get as much as $2,000 to $3,000 to help with rent and/or utility payments. So there is help available now, and I think that's very important. The other thing I'll mention is that the filing of an eviction case, even if the tenant manages to avoid being evicted and gets financial help, there's still a serious impact on creditworthiness of the individual if they're sued in eviction, and that's a very serious problem. And I think we need to think about ways to facilitate help for tenants so that we don't have to get to the point of having as many evictions filed. There have to be ways to do that. Perhaps others want to comment too.
John, a question. Can they negotiate with their landlords? Do you recommend that?
Absolutely. And, I think what we've seen in the past few months is that quite a few landlords have been willing to provide some payment plans and other temporary forgiveness. So certainly tenants, the Apartment Owners Association is always trying to get me to say this, and I am happy to say it. If a tenant is in trouble financially and having trouble paying their rent, it's important for them to reach out to their landlord and to see if they can come up with a plan. And the good news is now that there are some significant sources of financial help.
If a family has a particular issue with a landlord, what's the best way to reach out to an organization like Legal Aid?
Well, reaching out to Legal Aid is easy. You call our Legal Aid line, 513-241-9400, and say you have a housing problem. And we have very skilled intake workers who will, take down the information, and we will figure out how we can help. I also want to mention that the clerk of court has created a help center in the courthouse that also is working remotely now, and that's also a place where tenants can go for some help and advice.
Thank you so much. So several of you as a panelist have mentioned that there is relative inaction at the federal and at the state level in terms of policy. One of our audience members asked, are there any collaborative efforts locally to lobby the Ohio General Assembly to pass pay to stay and other legislation?
I'm not really aware of any, but maybe Peg is, I'm not sure. Again, Southwest Ohio's delegation tends to be fairly unified and address state issues that are important to the region, regardless of their political identity. And yet, my view of the General Assembly is that this is not on their radar. Perhaps others have a different opinion.
This is John, and I agree with that. I think that pay to stay is a policy that probably is going to have to be undertaken at the local level. I understand that just earlier this month, the City Council in Toledo is started considering passing such legislation. I and other housing advocates have been talking with members of our City Council here in Cincinnati about pay to stay for quite a while. It hasn't gained any traction until now, but I really think that we're at a point now where local leaders ought to think very seriously about implementing those kinds of policies. I think the need is clear.
One thing I'll add, John, Virginia Talent had shared with me that the village of Yellow Springs has passed a pay-to-stay ordinance during the pandemic. So that is open-ended. We don't know when the pandemic is going to end, but they have passed pay-to-stay legislation. And I don't know if they've had any court challenges, but for a village like Silverton and probably like Yellow Springs to be the case that is tried to validate, we would hope, pay-to-stay legislation at the local level, it's probably a bridge too far for a small community. So I would urge my colleagues at the City of Cincinnati or Toledo or Cleveland, Columbus to be the ones to litigate that on our collective behalf.
And I'll add, if I can, what Tom is saying is that unfortunately, if a municipality enacts a pay-to-stay ordinance, there's unfortunately a fair chance that someone will challenge that.
But if I could just add, John, I'm sure we agree on this, but if you and I have a private contract and I breach it, and you shouldn't have the right to just simply cancel it without giving me an opportunity to cure a contract. And yet in tenant law, landlord-tenant law, landlords don't have to give the tenant the right to cure that. And it's so detrimental to the person's credit, and it starts that downward cycle of poverty. So this is a system that needs to be addressed.
I would say that other than the policy issue, which I agree is dead on arrival at the state at this point, The governor, there is still quite a bit of unspent CARES money at the state level, and there have been, there is an effort to get more of that money committed to direct rent assistance. It doesn't address the policy issue, but if we could get some of that money released as rent assistance, especially given that it looks like the feds are not going to act in the near term, I think that would be very useful. So Ohio has been a big part of that under the guise of preventing homelessness. There have been others as well.
Thank you all for that really comprehensive view of that question. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of the participants that are sending in several great questions. So we want to make sure we are able to get to as many of these as possible. So a question from one of our audience members: is there anything that tenants can do, or any ideas of legislation to address the high eviction filing fees that tenants face once an eviction is filed? I often work with people who must pay $300 to $400 extra in fees on top of the past due rent to avoid court.
Well, that's a good question and an important question. This is John speaking. And so the typical filing fee for an eviction case in Hamilton County is somewhere between $100 and $150. It costs around $100 if the claim for eviction is the only claim brought. If the landlord is also bringing an additional claim for compensation to recover the unpaid rent, then the filing fee cost goes up. What often happens, though, is that landlords will insist that the tenant not only pay their back rent and catch up and pay the court costs, but they also ask that the tenant pay the some or all of the filing of the attorney's fees costs involved in filing the eviction case. And there's nothing in the law that prevents landlords from requiring that at this time. I think one of the things that illustrates is how we have to try to create programs that kick in and provide assistance so that the filing of evictions can be reduced, and we have fewer evictions being filed, so those costs can be avoided.
John, to follow up, I want to be clear. I think those are not court costs that the landlord are imposing. The landlord pays the court costs because they're the moving party, I believe. But those are fees or fines or charges that they're trying to pass on to the tenant because she or he was in breach of their lease and they filed for an eviction. So it's between two private parties, unless there was legislation that regulated the amount of late fees that could be imposed under a lease in the city of Cincinnati or the village of Silverton. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. I was focused on the court filing fees that the landlord pays, and then once the tenant pay and attorney's fees, there can also be late fees involved, of course, as well. And those are permitted if they're part of the rental agreement. There are some limits on late fees in some areas. City of Cincinnati has some legislation about that.
Thank you. This is a question directed at you. So, John, you said that landlords win eviction cases and tenants generally don't because they aren't represented. Can you talk more about this? And is this where a housing court might help?
I think right off the bat, a housing court could really help. There's been a lot of talk and advocacy about having that. It's something that is in Housing Our Future as a recommendation. So yes, I think a housing court can make a difference. In terms of tenants having representation, more tenants should be represented by council. The city of Cincinnati and Hamilton County have increased their funding to legal aid in a modest amount, and that's important and helpful, but still the vast majority of tenants go unrepresented. There is no right to be represented by a lawyer in civil cases, and not, and so there's no right to be represented by a lawyer in eviction cases. It's not like criminal cases, where in most criminal cases there's a right to have appointed counsel if you can't afford hiring your own lawyer. So that's a real need. And I think that having lawyers playing a role in eviction defense along with emergency rental assistance creates a situation where there really is an increased likelihood that the landlord and the tenant will be able to work things out in a way that works for everybody.
And one of our audience members asked, how can someone get involved with advocacy?
Well, so from our perspective here at Legal Aid, we are hopeful that the City of Cincinnati will come back with additional ideas on how to address the eviction crisis. And, I think that it's important for people to try to stay in touch with what's going on with that. There are various groups that provide information about those things. Local Initiative Support Corporation, I think, is very interested in those policy issues and would be a good place to keep up to date on those things. We do have a local affordable housing coalition, Affordable Housing Advocates, that has a website that provides information. So I think there are ways for citizens to find out and get involved, but I think we have to enhance those systems as well. So I think it's an important question.
Would any of the other panelists like to add? All right. I don't know if you're hearing an echo, so I'll repeat that. Would any of our other panelists like to add any additional comments around how people can get involved with advocacy?
No, I'm just late to the game to get involved myself. So I share the question, and I think this call and this session is important to go beyond this session and to create the structures and enhance what John was talking about.
And I would say at the state level, there are some resources. I would suggest the greaterohio.org website. There are good ideas about getting involved and organizing in your community, and also there are resource pages on housing and COVID-19 response and recovery. So you might want to just take a look at some of the resources there to get a sense. There's also a policy platform that you might find useful if you're really just beginning to think about how to get involved.
Thank you. So someone asks, what is a simple message we can send to our community for renters in trouble?
So what I'd say about this from our perspective at Legal Aid is that there's a bit of a tendency by human beings when they're faced with adversity to maybe not do anything, to just hope it goes away. And like with foreclosures, the most important thing to do is to seek help. The same thing is true for evictions. And unfortunately, we're in a situation right now where we have the health center at the courthouse, we have CAA, we have Talbert House, Free Store, and others who are available to help. So reach out if you or are in trouble with rent, or you know someone who is. Don't hesitate to seek help.
The other thing to start to is that if you get an eviction notice, a date to go to court, don't ignore it, because that's an automatic eviction, right? And John will know a lot more about that than I do. We don't pretend to practice law.
Well, that's right. You know, what I hope is that when people get any kind, when they fall behind in their rent, they should seek help right now. And if they get just a 3-day notice, which is the thing you get in advance of getting the actual court papers, by all means seek help, because, like I was saying earlier, once the eviction case is filed, various credit reporting agencies pick up on that, and regardless of whether a tenant avoids eviction or not, there's still going to be adverse consequences from the filing of that eviction case. Typically, landlords, when they're looking at applicants for admission as tenants, they're going to look at the eviction records. And, you know, there's a tendency by landlords to say, if someone had an eviction filed against them recently, they're just not going to take a chance on that person. So we have to find a way to have fewer evictions getting filed. And I think we can do that in a way that works for both tenants and landlords.
Thank you. And I encourage all of the participants to continue to ask questions in the chat. If we're not able to get to all of the questions, we will definitely follow up with a Q&A resource. So a question for you, Peg. What are other effects of housing instability related to losing your housing, even if you're not evicted, but lose the home you once held?
That's devastating. I mean, at Ohio Capitol, that's part of our mission, is that we work so that everyone can have a place to call home, right? And I'm not sure I have. I mean, I think the other, you know, often there are other issues. So for example, right now, with many children learning virtually, the idea that your children won't have the ability to learn, they won't have a place to learn if they're supposed to be learning at home. Seniors are isolated as it is, and it becomes a major health issue. And for folks who are trying to go to work, it's very hard to work regularly and consistently and keep a job when you have to constantly be worrying about whether or not you're going to come home and find your stuff out on the sidewalk. So those are some obvious things that happen. If any of you have not read Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, I highly recommend it. It really does a good job at describing in real terms all the things that happen as a result of eviction and all the impacts on a life that go on for years. And to think, as Tom pointed out, sometimes it's under $1,000 that triggers this whole cycle.
And this is John. If I can add to that, I think that's Peg really sums it up very well. But I'm guessing that most of the people on the call might not have been faced with an eviction in their life. And you know, when I think about what happens to our clients who are being threatened with eviction, I think about how difficult it is to move from one house to another, even if you're doing it voluntarily and you want to do it. I mean, how stressful is that? It's expensive, it takes time, and it's disruptive. And how much worse can it be? It's much, much worse if you are forced to move on short notice after you've gone to court, and you know you don't have the financial resources. You can't find a decent place to move to because no other landlord will rent to you. Evictions are just totally devastating.
A simple but important question asked is, are there different rules for evictions in each place? So looking at the first suburbs, do they have different rules than in the city of Cincinnati?
Yes. Cincinnati has, I think, passed legislation that limits things like late fees and puts a cap on them, and I'm not aware of any suburbs that have done anything similar to that. So, but generally speaking, this is not a policy issue that has been addressed by cities, villages, and townships. So I think the default is to state law and the Hamilton County courts, and they're treated the same, and there I would say they're treated badly by the system that we have. Eviction is a very blunt instrument, and we've talked, and John and Peg both articulated eloquently what happens when you get eviction. But it's the only tool that the landlord seems to have at the moment, and we need to figure out a better and different way. They're losers in the eviction process as well, and while we probably all have a lot of less sympathy for corporations and landlords, they need an additional way to address the problem that they're facing.
Sort of connected to that, how can we begin to understand the extent of the crisis if many people are losing homes through informal evictions or choosing to combine households to reduce housing costs?
So this is John, and I think that the question gets at one aspect that Desmond addresses in his book, and that is the phenomenon of self-help evictions, where some landlords will threaten to terminate utilities or change locks, and in some cases may even do that as a way of forcing tenants out and avoiding the cost of eviction. That is not legal in Ohio. It's a violation of the Landlord-Tenant Act, but it does go on. It's really difficult to get a handle on how much it goes on because it's all, as the question says, it's happening below the surface. It's not transparent. And at Legal Aid, we do have a lawyer on duty every day to assist tenants who are being threatened with self-help evictions, and we get calls every day. It's usually a situation where the tenant has been threatened rather than the landlord actually turning off utilities. But in some cases, the landlords even go as far as turning off the water. And it's not only a violation of the landlord-tenant law, I think it's just unethical.
I agree. John just said, I'll simply add that I think this points to the importance of LISC's work and the need to create 40,000 additional affordable housing units in our county, and that really needs to be the priority to address that issue. I'll in part answer the question by raising another problem that I've become aware of, which is there are a number of places, including Silverton, where there's a growing number of single-family homes that are now owned by hedge funds out of New York or wherever they're from. Many of these homes went through a foreclosure process back in 2008 and 2009, and they're now owned by an out-of-town corporate landlord that somehow managed to combine the ruthlessness of Wall Street and to do it at a scale that's really incredible. And we at the local government level are not often aware of the extent to which homes that used to be owner-occupied are now owned by a distant corporation. And this needs to be studied and understood better in our region, I believe, because we've taken out of supply a good number of homes that people would want to buy and own and occupy. And in addition to that, I'll just add one other thing. Many of these corporations will shift responsibility for home maintenance and other acts, mowing the grass, that sort of thing, to the tenant. And they have a higher rate of eviction than your typical landlord, your mom and pop small investment property owner.
So this is John, and I agree with Tom. Out-of-town landlords, when one complains about out-of-town landlords, it might sound like you're being sort of too much of a Cincinnatian or Cincinnati area person and all in favor of, Cincinnati as opposed to the rest of the world. But I'll tell you, out-of-town landlords tend to be way worse than local landlords, and it's a growing problem.
That is. So we have about 5 minutes left in this Q&A portion, and I would love to hear from each of the panelists. If people carry with them nothing else from this session, what is one or a couple of bits of information that you hope that they remember that should rise to the top?
I think one thing is that any one of us, many of us, are a paycheck away from not being able to pay our rent, and that it is becoming an epidemic in our communities. And I wholly support Tom's idea that, notion that this needs to be elevated as on the public policy agenda. So to the extent that any of you feel compelled to get active in that regard, there are two things. One is we do need emergency rental assistance in the coming months, because those jobs are not coming back right away, no matter what happens with the virus or what happens with the election. The second thing is that we need the public policy solutions to try to address, and it is true that the landlords are not all evil. I work with a lot of landlords, and they have bills to pay too. So and it costs a lot of money to operate a quality, affordable housing community. So I think both the public policy and the direct assistance are necessary in the sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Peg.
So this is John. I'll let Tom go last if he wants to. And but Tom mentioned a little while ago the fact that the Housing Our Future study recognizes the 40,000 unit gap in affordable housing in Hamilton County. And one of the big goals of Housing Our Future is to end that gap. And I think the plan sets a realistic goal of developing 2,000 affordable rental units every year until we eliminate the gap. And that is the kind of big picture solutions that we need. And in addition to the various policies and programs we've been talking about to address the eviction crisis.
This is Tom. I'll agree and follow up on John's point, which is the one takeaway I would ask is that people understand that evictions are happening and happening at a high rate in communities that are not the city of Cincinnati. It's an addition to what's happening in the city of Cincinnati. And we at the local government level, again, need to better understand that poverty is something we have to be concerned about, and evictions drive poverty, and so we have to be concerned about evictions. And until we solve that 40,000 unit or whatever the number ultimately winds up to be, because as Peg pointed out, many of these jobs aren't coming back, that number is probably already out of date. It probably needs to be higher based on the economic conditions. We at the local government level, we need to be more engaged with LISC in this broader effort, because if we are going to address, and we need to address, childhood poverty, structural racism, we at the local government level need to change some of the policies that we have that are part of that, which include our zoning codes, which is the third rail of many local government public policy debates. We need to talk about densification and redevelopment and equity as we do that. I think it's still, again, and I hate to be the Debbie Downer on this, but I think we haven't done an adequate job yet of convincing and connecting the dots of how our local codes and policies and land use decisions are part and parcel of structural racism.
I second that.
Well, thank you all for sharing, and this concludes the Q&A portion of our session today. I am going to turn it over to Kristen Baker to say some additional comments.
Great. Thanks, Janae. And thank you to our panelists for their insight and contribution to this conversation. We know this is a complex issue, and we hope that the last hour has helped some of you who might be new to this topic learn a little bit more, and those of you that are certainly more knowledgeable, that you also gain some insights as well. So our next session will be in September, and we hope you can join us for that. There'll be a follow-up email with all the details on the session information, how to register, and we welcome any feedback that you have in terms of the format of this event. We're currently conducting these as presentation style, of course, but if you're looking for more interaction, we'd welcome your view on that as well, too. So please don't hesitate to reach out to those of us at LISC that are helping to facilitate these. And thank you so much to our panelists. We apologize for some of the technical difficulties. Hopefully we'll get those ironed out for the future session. And we appreciate your time today. So please check out LISC's website for more information on Housing Our Future and how to get involved. And thank you for joining us today.